Hi, it's Scott Rustrolds here on May 15th for today's edition of the Listen and Learn podcast. Thank you as always for tuning in. A couple of stories to talk about today. First, I want to bring up the story the Washington Post has just broken a few minutes ago, where supposedly President Trump discussed classified information with the Russian ambassador last week. Key point here, legally speaking, of course, is that a president can disclose, unclassify any information he wants unilaterally, so there's no legal issue here. But there's a lot of media sensationalism going on, and 2 points I would make before we, get too carried away here is one, the media has had this repeated examples of reporting a sensational headline, then the facts start coming in counter to it, and then never ever reporting a retraction. So actually, within the headline, within the story itself on Trump disclosing very sensitive information to the Russians, is this quote from National Security Advisor Henry McMaster, who is a man of unimpeachable integrity. And it says that the president and the foreign minister reviewed common threats from terrorist organizations to include threats to aviation. Now, that's not surprising that they're talking about aviation, because as we discussed last week, a ban on laptops being used in flights from Europe is imminent due to a specific credible threat. So that's in the public domain. And McMaster goes on to say, at no time were any intelligence sources or methods discussed, and no military operations were disclosed that were not already known publicly. So McMaster is pretty emphatically saying here that there was nothing disclosed that shouldn't have been. No sources, no methods, and the threats that they're talking about with aviation are already well known in the public discourse. We know that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are working on ways on smuggling bombs inside of laptops where they can't be detected to try and blow up an airliner, and that was what was discussed with the Russians. So again, it really feels like when you listen to what McMaster has to say, the media is getting way out of itself, which is just this continuing trend, and is a reason why media has lost credibility with so many people. So I suggest you tap the brakes, wait a couple of days before we move on to the next debunked outrage machine. Meanwhile, I want to bring up 3 stories that I think are a little bit more interesting and substantive today. First is what's going on in the state of Connecticut. So over the past week, the governor of Connecticut, Dan Malloy, has come out and said that his budget will have a $400 million budget deficit, which means that they're going to wipe out what remains in the state's rainy day fund. As a consequence of this, Moody's and Fitch, 2 credit rating agencies, have downgraded the state's creditworthiness, saying that Connecticut is not as safe as they once were. And why is that? The state has amassed 4 times as much debt as the average state has per capita. It's $23 billion. Plus, they have an underfunded pension to the tune of about $50 billion. So net, you've got a state that is $73 billion in the hole. Has some of the highest taxes in the country, and yet it still can't balance its budget. And that's where I think this chart here is quite interesting, that shows the employment in Connecticut versus employment in the country as a whole. And I indexed it to 100 in year 2000. So since the start of the century, overall U.S. employment has gone up by about 10%. Connecticut's employment is flat. And this is what happens when you have high taxes and high debt loads. And the problem with high taxes and high debt loads is they eventually become self-defeating, because you crimp growth, you lead people to exodus your state, and as a consequence, you can't pay back the debt. So borrowing too much and taxing too high in the long run ends up being self-defeating. And there's a lesson here for the nation at large and for other states that are battling high taxes and big budget deficits, that if you don't get the situation under control, eventually the situation becomes uncontrollable. And you're seeing Connecticut is still a very wealthy state, has a lot of resources available to it. But the fact that you're seeing a less employment today than 16 years ago, credit rating downgrades, and the loss of any remaining rainy day fund just speaks to a state that's got serious problems. And we need to start taking care of these issues at the federal level, so that we're not sitting here in 15 years talking about how the federal government in 2030 is like Connecticut was in 2017. Third story that really is outrageous is what's going on in the UN in North Korea. So over the weekend, you had North Korea again fire more missiles as it continues to test its capabilities. Just a reminder of how aggressive the North Korean regime has become. There also have been some reports that are unconfirmed that North Korea is the agent behind the massive cyber attack on Friday and over the weekend. But so you would expect the UN, given the fact that you have National Security Council resolutions placing sanctions on North Korea, would not be cooperating with them in any way. However, WIPO, which is their patent office, is currently in the process of helping North Korea acquire a global patent for a chemical weapon called sodium cyanide. In fact, what makes this most amazing is the Security Council has put on sanctions banning any UN member nation from exporting sodium cyanide to North Korea. So on the one hand, you have an arm of the UN saying no country can export this chemical weapon to North Korea. On the other side, you have another agency within the UN that is actively helping North Korea develop patents for chemical weapons. And you really have to ask yourself, what the heck is going on with the UN? How is this not being coordinated at all with the Security Council and stopped? Why are we making it easier for North Korea to attain chemical weapons and quickly attain patents for them and try and circumvent sanctions? And I think the U.S. really has to start asking, why are we giving $8 billion to a global organization that, while it spends half of its days berating Israel and seemingly the other half now helping North Korea, which has become a complete menace to the world? It boggles the mind. It's completely incomprehensible. It's a story that needs to get a lot more attention. And if we're going to have a global response to North Korea, which is what we need to stiffen up sanctions. We need China to apply more economic leverage. We can't then have the UN making life easier for them on the back end. It just does not work. So it's an outrageous story, deserves a lot more attention. And I would just suggest you take further look into it your own. But we have the UN trying to make it easier for North Korea to acquire chemical weapons. It's just boggling. And then the fourth, and today on a little bit of a lighter note, there's so much talk about the lack of ingenuity in our economy, the lack of productivity growth, and that we're not as vibrant as we were. And that's where I want to highlight this thing, which I think is quite interesting. So over the weekend, Russia and Saudi Arabia have agreed to continue to cut their oil production for the next 12 months in an effort to try and stabilize oil prices. And the reason why comes down to is that the U.S. is just getting more competitive than they ever could imagine. And if you look at this chart here, in the major shale basins, over the past 4 years, the break-even cost for U.S. oil has been cut in half. We've been able to, 4 years ago, there in most of these areas, we needed $75 oil to be able to drill economically. Thanks to the productivity gains of American engineers, we're now able to extract oil at $40 or less and still have our oil companies make money, which is just cut oil, helped consumers everywhere, cutting oil prices, and it's put all these oil states on the run. It's completely changed the geopolitical balance of power as we move closer to North America being an energy independent region. It's straining bad regimes in Venezuela and in Russia and forcing them to try and cut production to stay competitive with the U.S. So it's just remarkable that after years of being beholden to OPEC, you're seeing American ingenuity create massive productivity gains in U.S. oil production that continue to lower break-evens through and below what you see in the rest of the world, and it's forcing OPEC on the run, really. And it's just an incredible story. So those are really the four big things I think are worth highlighting today. As always, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the videos, please subscribe and share them with your friends. You can also follow us on Facebook at the Listen and Learn Podcast and follow me on Twitter at Read and Learn. Have a great night, everyone.